Okay, so hopefully, nope. Hopefully you watched the video and you loved it in some of the same ways that I love that video, but also found some critiques that may have come out of it. And so I like this slide that was at the end, and really what this comprehensive assessment idea was about is all of these tenets, and it's that critical thinking approach to instruction and assessment. It's that engagement and performance interdisciplinary, so across many subjects, but it also has to be practical. And we'll talk about this a little bit, being, cost effective, right? We live in a society where education is tied to funds. And so this is a part of our battle as well. And, I had a video debrief set up for us, but I'm hoping you're thinking about what seems highly relevant to you. What do you want to hold on to when you go into your first classroom in terms of what you want assessment to look like? But also, what questions and critique came up. So I just know when I watch this video, it makes me think about what type of school this was done in. It looks to be a well-resourced school with a lot of parental involvement. And so just remembering what we've talked about in terms of parent involvement versus parent engagement, different types of schools that may or may not be able to fund huge, presentation nights like this, or that may need to seek out other ways to do this or to collect the funds to do it. And so it just seemed kind of like an ideal setting. Is it realistic for all schools? So that's a conversation that I think is important to have. And so let's just kind of go into it. We are still working off of this model, this interconnected model. We talked about planning and instruction, and we're moving on to assessment. Always remembering that still our students are at the center of our work and our plans. So we can't just create an assessment out of context, right? It has to fit our students. A lot of you are writing about how, is our lessons and instruction and assessment fitting our students, or are we making our students fit what we want? And I think that's just a highly relevant question. And so just assessment in general terms, it involves an observation of a sample student's behavior and drawing inferences about the student's knowledge and abilities. So there are some inferences and assumptions that go into assessment, and it depends on your knowledge of your students at the end of the day to implement the best assessment for a lesson. And we talked about alignment a large amount of time last lesson. And so they all have to be aligned. And so these are kind of just obvious, but some goals that we have for assessment. Just thinking about this idea of assessment as instruction. So students should be able to learn through their assessment, right? And so there's all these things that go into it, and we'll talk about them today. And so just some principles and tenets that we go by. You want to determine and clarify what you are even assessing. That's first and foremost. That comes from our objectives, right? And then select assessments according to the purpose to be served. And so they need to make sense, and that's where the alignment comes in. Does it match? Be aware of the strengths and the weaknesses that come with each one. You want to have a toolbox so you can employ different varieties, different variations of assessment, so that you're tapping into all of those different strengths that your students have. And just knowing it's an ongoing process. It's not a black and white thing. That has been a theme throughout this whole course. More purposes. So on your note catcher, you'll see there's these big domains for assessment. So summative being very evaluative. So this summative comes at the end. It's the sum. And it's largely a summary of what your students have learned at the conclusion of a lesson or a unit. It comes at the end. Diagnostic is that root word diagnosis. So it's a type of assessment. It precedes instruction, and you're just kind of assessing, what do my kids know? What do we need to work on? Where are the gaps? So a diagnostic assessment does that. And then formative, we've talked about, is really that informal assessment that happens. It can happen before, like a brief formative beforehand, so you know where to gauge and where your lesson should go that day. But also it happens during the lesson, so you can make modifications as you go. And formative assessments we'll talk about. It's in real time. They are planned, but they're very quick, and they're meant to inform your instruction primarily. And so here is kind of the big domains as well in terms of assessment. So you can see them all here: informal versus formal, paper pencil versus performance, standardized versus teacher developed, criterion versus norm referenced, and traditional versus authentic. And so I'm hoping you already have a firm grasp of what a lot of these terms mean, and today will just be kind of like solidifying that information. And so, just starting briefly with informal versus formal, you've got the informal, kind of more spontaneous, unplanned observations versus that formal where it's planned in advance. It's tied to a specific purpose. Your students know it's coming. They can prepare for it, things like that. And so you'll see like the picture of informals can just be a simple question, and you can gauge where your students are at based on that one question. And so some more characteristics of informal assessment. So it gives you continual feedback on your effectiveness ultimately, and allows you to make adjustments. And so it can support and reinforce the formal assessments that you deliver, but it can also question some results that you're seeing in terms of formal assessments. So they're a good duo. And then these informal assessments are kind of like, my check-ins. That's kind of an SEL, informal assessment. And so there's different types, not just content-driven informal assessment, but you're checking on those factors that ultimately affect student performance. And very tied to that is this idea of formative versus summative. And so we talked about, formative being before or during instruction. And so I love this metaphor of when the chef tastes the soup. So a formative is very much like, how is this going? What changes do I need to make so that the end product is hitting our objective, our yummy soup? And so, you can gain insight from this on homework. You can gain insight on class assignments, on short quizzes, things like that. Whereas summative is assessing students' achievement after instruction. So a summative, comes like we already discussed at the end. So like a final exam. And so I just wanted to underscore that, formative assessment is really the cornerstone of instruction and assessment because it's so crucial to helping you inform where your lesson goes. Part of your evaluations as teachers is based off of your responsivity and flexibility. And that a lot of times just comes from these formative assessments. Like if you ask a question and there's silence from the room, you need to know, okay, I need more scaffolds right now, or I need to review. I need to go back and review, or we're not getting anywhere going in the direction I planned. We need to regroup and do something else today. Those come from informal assessments, formative assessments. Criterion and norm reference tests, I'm sure you've heard a lot about these. And so criterion reference tests are what students have and have not accomplished relative to predetermined standards. And so this is not based on other students. Norm reference are based on other students' performances. So examples, criterion reference test is very much that FSA test. It's all standards based. Students aren't competing against other students. They're competing against whether they met the standards or not. AP tests they have specific standards that need to be met, objectives that the tests are evaluating. Whereas a norm reference test is, you can think of SAT. It's based on comparisons of how other students in the nation did. You get where you fell in regard to other students on the SAT. IQ tests are an example of like norm reference in comparison to other people. Teacher created tests are going to be probably norm reference because she, he, they are going to be evaluating student scores based on the class, right? Teachers can also create tests that are very aligned to the standards too. So there's some gray area with these. You want to take everything with a grain of salt because teaching, and we've talked about this, is such a contextualized domain. Traditional being, just that traditional thing that you think of when we say assessment, paper, pencil. They defined, though, it means that it's not something that reflects outside things and skills that they're going to need in the outside world. Whereas authentic assessment is very much that measuring student knowledge and skills based in a real life context. You're thinking about like vocational schools are very authentic. You can try to set up authentic assessments in your classroom. It can be, I don't know if it's as practical, right? It can be time consuming and costly. So while authentic is beautiful, it's not always possible. And then alternative is kind of what we saw in that video a lot with these like student presentations. Students are making portfolios. They might perform a skit or a play. They may create like a huge visual poster, things like that. Your midterm is very alternative assessment. You guys turned in all different types of products. And so alternative assessments are a way for you to mix it up a lot. I think there's a lot of strengths in this one. And when you think of alternative, it's like a choice menu, right? So your next activity is you're going to pick one of these. You can pick all three if you want the practice, but you probably won't. Summative, diagnostic, or formative, and jot down one concrete example of one of these that you've either experienced or that you would like to use. This is good practice for you. So go ahead and do that, and I'll see you on the other side.